So this is about Express 101. So I know there was some questions in the previous talk about Express. So if you guys have any questions about specifically about Express or even Node, you guys can just stand up and raise your hand up. I'll answer it during the talk, after the talk, whenever. So she already told me about who I am, so I'm going to skip that whole part, boring part, and we'll get to right into what is Express. So before that, anyone used Express here? A few people? Okay, awesome. Yeah. Okay, awesome. So you guys, the people that have used Express are going to be bored. The people that haven't used Express are going to like it a lot. And so essentially, what is Express? Express is a great way to, all right, so we launch it? Yeah, okay, so Express is a great way to write web apps or APIs in Node. All right, cool. Now they're just recording stuff, so just want to make sure it's recorded so you guys can like pick up on all the mistakes I've made later. A lot of it. So Express is one of the most popular modules out there. Like if you go into npm.org, like #1 is Express, or probably #2. It's super popular. Pretty much everyone who's writing a Node.js API or web app is using Express or a framework based on Express. There's some other popular ones, but not as popular as Express. What's cool about Express is that it's been there since like the dawn of Node.js, not day one, but it's been there for a long time. So it's gone through many, many iterations. I think we're at 3.x1 now or something, but soon we're going to be hitting 4. It's already in beta. And 4 is a big paradigm shift. We won't be covering 4 just because it's not out yet. But 4 really gets into, it really changes the dynamics of Express while keeping all the concepts you learned today the same, but the way it's structured is kind of different. So let's take a look. That's a simple Express app right there. And the presentation's done, so you guys know what to do now. No, so all Express is, you go require Express, you take that module, you initialize it, and then you go app.gets /. So whenever someone goes to mywebsite.com, which automatically gives a /, it will respond saying hello world. If you go to myapp.conference / and you type in something after the colon, then it's going to write the parameter out. So this is kind of neat. If you take this example and you build on it, for example, if you were, say, Uber uses Node.js a lot. If you were writing the Uber API, Uber goes, all right, we want you to write our API. So the first thing you would do is say login or registration. So let's take a look at the example of registration. You would go uber.com/API/register, and you would send an HTTP post. Or you would go /user and send an HTTP post to it. And in the post object, you'd have username and password and some other garbage like phone number, the credit card number, or whatever. So using the same technique, instead of doing app.get, you would do app.post, and you would do request.body. And you would get the entire post object as a JSON body. So we'll get into all that. It's just a little example. And then app.listen, port 8080 is basically what port I want to listen to. I like listening to port 8080, but 3000 is more common in JavaScript world. But why even use Express, Why even bother with Express? Can't I do the same stuff in Node? I mean, doesn't that the promise of Node where it's super lightweight, I can do whatever I want with it? Yes and no, you can totally do everything in Node, but just like, the analogy I like using is Express is to Node what jQuery is to JavaScript. You can do everything in JavaScript. You don't need jQuery. But jQuery has all sorts of little helper functions and all that stuff that makes writing JavaScript easier. You can use $selector instead of doing document.getElementById and all that crap. So that's our Express app that we were just showing. And this is the same app if you were doing Node. You would have to do the exact same thing. Now imagine you are writing the Uber API or Groupon API. That would easily end up being like 50 trillion lines of code. And then imagine you forgot like a semicolon somewhere there. Then you're screwed. You might as well just quit because you're never gonna figure it out there. So that's why you need Express because you could take all that garbage, and you can convert it to something that looks really nice like that. So yeah, Express encapsulates everything in a great solid API. So let's see how you even get started in Express and some cool little helper functions. If you guys have any questions during the talk, ask me. Otherwise, we're going to be done in like 2 more minutes. So let's get started. We're going to do lots of live coding here. Kind of, code's already written, but I'm going to like edit it, pretend I'm coding. So sample, before we get to sample 1, I'm going to open up terminal. The best way to always use Express is you go npm. Everyone see this? Let me zoom it in. All right, npm install g express. Now, you guys already know what g means. Maybe the guy before me covered it, but g just installs the module globally so that it's available everywhere. And you don't have to do that for Express, but when you first install Express, I recommend you do it simply because you can pull off the following trick. Let's go FITC, then you go into it. Okay, so you can go Express FITC app. And you press enter, and what it does is automatically goes ahead and it scaffolds your entire app. So if you look here, if you go into FITC app, you can see that the entire apps are in for you. You can go home for the day, right? You're going to spend like 8 hours on that anyways. So if we take a look at what it did, it created an app.js file, which goes ahead and writes the code for you, which is always really good for us. It imports Express. It creates a routes file where you can set up all your routing. It includes all the modules for those routes, like the user stuff. It includes HTTP, and it does a lot of stuff here, which we'll get into in detail in just a sec. Then it creates a views folder. It has index.jade. 1 second. Okay, I'll just drag it in here. Jade is basically it's just a simple little templating language for, I guess it was made exclusively for Node or Ruby, I'm not sure. But it's just a templating language. Instead of writing HTML, you can write Jade. Frankly, I don't like Jade. I already know HTML. I don't want to learn another thing just to write HTML code. So we'll look at Handlebars, which is basically taking HTML and putting curly brackets instead of changing how HTML looks like. So that's that. And then in the routes, that's where Express automatically generated a bunch of files. Index, so whenever someone hits / it will render Express. When someone hits /list, I guess, we'll have to look at the routes. It will respond with a resource. And then you look at public, and this is where if you were writing a web app that is backed by a Node.js server, so not like an Angular app or something that's run client-side, but something that's rendered server-side, then that's where you'll actually use Jade. That's where you'll use this public folder where you tell Node that, all right, everything in this public folder is publicly accessible. I don't want you to do any pre-processing on it. Like, if you were to do /, Node's actually going to go in, take a look at your Jade file, take a look at all your data, put it together, and spit out HTML for the browser. But if someone goes to /stylesheets /style.css, you don't want Node interfering with that process. You can install plugins for it that convert your Sass to CSS on the fly, but that's not the point of this. And then you got package.json, which the guy before me talked about. We won't look at that. So let's see. So that's what's in Express. Simple command, like the most simplest command ever to get started. Express, type in your app name. You can then go in and delete all the stuff. Like in this presentation, we're going to talk about more specifically towards writing APIs than writing a Node.js backed web app. So we'll just go in and delete all the stuff we don't need and just keep the API part of it. We just talked about this. All right, Express works, perfect. So let me open up my folder here. All the sample code I just put on the USB, so I guess it'll be available for you guys soon. All right, can everyone read that? Fine, perfect. Okay, so this stuff I'm not going to talk about. I think you guys are all experts in what require does now. So what's really important in Express, and this is actually changing in Express 4.0, but the concept's the same. It's just the way you declare this stuff is kind of different, is setting the environment variables for Express. Here, line 1, straightforward. It says set the port to either the process, the global environment port, or 3000. The reason why this is important, that you should always have process.env.port, is when you're deploying to, say, Heroku or AppFog or Node.js, whatever your favorite cloud Node.js hosting thingy is, it's not going to use port 3000. It's going to internally have have some port routing or whatever. So Node, for example, Heroku throws you on port 5000 or something. So you'll always want to use that because your app is flexible. It just automatically uses the port that's there. And then if you're running it locally, it'll use port 3000. So you don't have to worry about changing your code just for deployments. The next one is where the views folder is. So if you were writing a Node.js backed web app, then you would need to tell Node where all your views are. So all this does is says, all right, when the app runs, go into the current directory /views. So the current directory /views right here. I hope you guys can see it. That's index.jade and layout.jade. What we just saw. The next thing is actually telling Node.js, hey, I'm going to be using the Jade engine. And in the next example, we'll talk about the HBS Handlebars engine, but all it says is I'm going to be using Node engine. Next one, it says use a favicon. Pretty self-explanatory. This one just says, okay, this is a development environment, spit out all the development log. And the next stuff, these 3 lines, basically say convert, when you do an HTTP post, convert that stuff into JSON, a URL encoded, and just fix up post, get, and all that stuff. And then app.router is important when you have static resources. So when you have something like, when a URL first comes in, if you go to /stylesheet/style.css, it will first look through all your router files and say, do I have to listen to this file? If I don't, and then go to the public directory and try to find it. So that's all those 2 lines are doing. Yes. Oh, use is just telling app is a Express variable. So use is just saying, hey, Express, you set this in your configuration. It's just setting up configuration. Yeah, and use is saying use this. Use is basically saying use this middleware, and it's a function that's actually runs. So express.favicon and all these guys are actually functions that are internal somewhere. And so use just says use this whenever a request comes in. Use this function. Call this function basically. Yeah, yeah. Yes, so whenever, for example, whenever you were to run the script, it will actually go ahead and execute all these functions and use the result, set it up. Right? Any other questions about that? Okay, and then here, we'll just saying, okay, if the environment is a development environment, we're gonna use error handling so Express can print out really nice, pretty errors. And lastly, the most important part is these 2, app.get and then app.get. Obviously, it's just slash and then /user. So if you were to run this example right now, where is this? Okay, samples 1. Okay, oops, I spelled FITC wrong. Amazing. Okay, we're gonna run it, and I'm gonna use a tool called NodeMon. Anyone here use NodeMon? Yes. So NodeMon is a great tool. Unlike Node, if you could obviously just do node.app.js, and it will run perfectly fine. But when there's when you go in, for example, here, and I'm gonna change something. I'm gonna write app.get /FITC, and I'm gonna get it to respond to something. Res.send hello. Okay, if I actually go to localhost 3000 right now and type in FITC, it's not going to actually respond. It's going to say cannot get. But wait a minute, it's obviously there. That's because I'm running Node. I'm not running nodemon. When you run nodemon, whenever you make a change to your JavaScript file, it automatically reloads everything. So if I go nodemon app.js, and for example, if I change hello to this is cool, save it, you can see that it automatically went there, restarted your JavaScript file, and deployed it. Super useful, right? When you're actually developing, the last thing you want to do is keep going back to terminal, Control-C. The first thing I did when I started Node.js, and I was like, I hate this language. This is garbage. I don't know why anyone likes this, but it's actually cool once you find nodemon. So, okay, ignoring that, we take a look at, this is cool, right? So it ran, and we were gonna talk about just hitting it normally. It says welcome to Express. So let's just break down what happened there in detail. The first thing it did was the following. When I hit localhost / it went to app.get. It said, hey, I have an entry here, /. So it's going to go, okay, where do I go? Roots.index. Okay, where's roots? I go up. All right, roots is in /roots. So I'm going to go here. And then I'm going to go to index.js because that's what it's calling. And then index says, here's a function, export.index. Guy before me did a great talk on public and stuff here, making it exportable. So basically function request.res. Express always, for every route, it always takes a function with 2 parameters. You can put more parameters in that do other stuff, but request and response are important. Request basically gives you all the details about a request. Response is basically what you write out. So you might have noticed here it says res.render, whereas in the quick little example I did, app.get, I did res.send. The difference there is res.send is I'm sending some content there. Here's just a string. I can pass in a JSON object. For example, I can go var hello, and then I can pass in the object, right? Straightforward. If I run this, FITC responds the JSON object. Great for an API. But res.render, on the other hand, actually calls, when you run res.render, internally, for sure, it's calling res.send. It takes a big HTML string and it sends it off to the client. But what res.render does it, you go, find the index template and populate it with this JSON object. So first it's going to go to the index template, and it's going to go, all right, where do I populate the JSON object? Here we have a parameter. Assume you have a parameter here, right here called a title. So it's going to take the JSON object that you passed in and populate it with the title. Straightforward, right? And then you hit / again, and it renders. And then if you look at the source code, it's not Jade or anything because browsers can't read Jade. It's just HTML. That's because Express took that, did all the parsing internally, and then built a big, long, well, not that long, but it built a pretty good HTML string and sent it to the server, with the browser. The browser got it, rendered it. So that's what res.render does, pretty much. Okay, so going back to here, so that's what essentially happens. It looks at the parameter, it looks at the route, and then it calls up whichever, if you're doing res.render, it'll find a template. If you're doing res.send, it will just send a string. Res.send has multiple stuff. You can send in like a HTTP response header, so you can send 200. This is a great request, or 404. You're not allowed, or 500, and shit went wrong, stuff like that. Okay, we talked about Jade. Okay, so this is where the rest of the presentation is going to be, building great APIs with stuff. Okay, so before that, let me just talk about Handlebars, because I do like it. It's not the focus of the talk, so I'll just quickly run over it. Express.js Express3-handlebars is a module. Instead of using Jade, you can use handlebars. How do handlebars look like? Like HTML. That's HTML right there. Nothing complicated. You don't have to learn a new syntax or anything. And essentially, it's as simple as going app.set view engine is handlebars, and you configure the engine handlebars, and you say what's the default layout. The default layout in this case is main. You just have to respect the folder structure for this module. So you have to create a folder called layouts and have all your layouts there. So layouts are stuff that don't change, obviously, and the rest of the stuff is what's constantly changing. Simple, straightforward. We won't even run the example. You guys can run it at home. Let's get to the API stuff. That's what's cool. All right. So here we're going to just run over this quickly. App.get we know about, but let's talk about app.post, because every example here we've talked about app.get. Let's see how post works. So here I'm going, whenever someone posts to localhost 3000, I'm going to respond by saying got the post, and then I'm going to take that whatever you sent in, and I'm going to spit it out in a string form. Best way to test it on a Mac, I use a client called REST client. You guys can use whatever you want. So localhost 3000, set the post. Now the parameter, let's call it conference FITC name mean stack. All right, I'm gonna send it. Oh, I didn't even run it. My bad. All right. No, first. All right, send. Okay, straightforward. I posted, I sent in parameters, conference FITC name is mean stack, and it said got the post. It responded with got the post, and it outputted the JSON object. Straightforward. Now, example, if you were doing something like a login system, right? You would go username, password, username is whatever, password is like whatever, some SHA string right there. Clearly that's not SHA. And then here we could do something like, all right, if request, well, let's go this. User object is equal to request dot body if user object dot password. If it exists, then res dot send good pass, and then if it doesn't exist, let's go res dot send bad pass, right? Something like that. It's super stupid, but yes. So I'm going to send it. It's going to say good pass. We're going to remove this. It's going to say bad pass, right? Now, that's just a really, really dumb example, but you can expand that example to write actual code where you go, all right, I'm going to insert it to the database, see what it gets back in return, and as long as you still have access to this res variable, you're good, right? You can always, wherever in your callback structure, you can call res.send and return it. Now, a little off topic, but there's some modules like, when you're writing code, you might, one of the parameters, one of the callbacks, you might use res as a variable, and then you'll sit there wondering why deep, like 3 callbacks down, your express is not returning. That's because res got overwritten by a local variable in that callback. So just be sure, not to use res anywhere else in this function. So everyone get that? It makes sense to everyone? Any confusion? Yes? Yes. So request is rec, it just basically means the request. So everything about the request. What we can do here is we can actually do console.log request, and we can just quickly see in a crude way what's all the parameters in the request. So if you look here, a lot of parameters, stuff you won't ever use, but there's stuff like, the domain, the socket, all the lower level details about the request object. If you go to the documentation, you can actually see stuff that you can physically use. For example, there's rec.params. That's usually used in GET requests. So here we can do conference name, right? and you can do console.log params. And if we call the get request here, oops, what did I do wrong? Yes, my bad. Ha ha ha. Hello. Yes. You can see, I won't call it hello, I'll say FITC. You can see that it outputs an array of parameters, right? And then if you can also pass in query strings, and you get those parameters also. So Express just gives you access to the entire URL structure, and you can read that data, act upon it however you want. It's great when you're building actual REST APIs that follow the REST order, so /users, and then you can build a whole API called /user/ID, /user/ID, and you can pass in them query parameters if you want to do something crazy with it. So that's building a straightforward API. Now, what if we were to go, all right, what if we were to actually write an API for our company, a really long API? The first thing you would do is you would write something like this, right? And you would just have posts and gets, posts and gets. Obviously not the same parameter. I just copied and pasted, I was lazy. But post and get, and this is horrible. You don't want to do this. So something else that you might do is go, all right, I'm going to break this up into many modules and just do it that way. That's a great idea. That's a first step, and I think that's acceptable in many cases where you're just writing API that is not 20 million lines of code. You're not launching a rocket to the moon with it. But if you want to go one step ahead, what you could do is use a great tool called express.namespace. Well, no, before we get to express.namespace, what you could do is if you want to break it up into many pieces, you can use a little pattern that we use at Dynamatic where we go through the controller folder and we load up all the modules that way. So for example, in my controllers, I have a module called testimonial. This is just a sample code I took from a project we're doing for testimonials. And testimonials, I have, let's ignore namespace for now because that's coming up. I want to talk about it. Okay, so you have, I have a method here called exports.setup. Now this exports.setup is not like a Node.js standard. You can just call it whatever, initialize, create my module, whatever. And all I do is I pass in the app instance here, and inside of it, everything that has to do with testimonials can go in here, right? So testimonial/company ID, I can post, create a new testimonial. I can do lots of stuff, put, delete, everything I want here. And the way I initialize it is using this snippet, and this stuff will be available, so we can just quickly browse through it. All it does is it goes through the controllers folders, finds all the JavaScript files, and it calls controller.setup. It requires it and calls controller.setup. Pretty straightforward, and it's that first step in order to abstracting your modules without using a lot of every time you create a module you don't want to require. So this script automatically runs through it, requires everything for you. It requires a bunch of smaller modules like file system and path, but it doesn't matter. So now you've done that, you've written a great solid API, perfect. You've written a great solid API, and you guys launch, and everyone's happy, your node stuff's running fine. And then your boss comes up to you and goes, all right, version 2 time. Version 1 hasn't even launched, but now we want to do version 2. Just the story with every product. So you have two options now. You can either, for example, the boss goes, instead of all this testimonial code, we want to change it. Example, if you guys were using something like MySQL, now we want to change to CouchDB, and all your MySQL code's here. So one thing you're going to have to do is, all right, I'm going to copy and paste this code into a new project and have that project running. Or I can quite possibly go testimonials. I can go something like API/testimonials or something, API version 1. But then now you have to type in API v1 onto all your hundreds and hundreds of Express methods. So Express is a great module called Express Namespace, which I deleted before. And what that does is it automatically namespaces your parameters with API, well, whatever you want. Here I use API/v1, but you can use whatever you want. Version 1, product one, whatever you want. All it's doing is just namespacing it so that later you can actually create another folder here in controllers, call it version 2, put in your other testimonial.js file there, change v1 to v2, and you have now API versioning, right? So you can rewrite your code here, do whatever you want, and you can tell your client API to go, all right, instead of calling API/v1, it's time to call API/v2, while still supporting older clients that don't want to upgrade. So it's a really powerful method to write that stuff. API versioning. Any questions about that? No? Okay. Lastly, just because we're almost out of time, I want to talk about Locomotive. Anyone use Locomotive here? No? Perfect. So the guys that use Express, this is something new. Locomotive is a framework built on top of Express. I'm just going to show live code from a project I'm doing here. All right. So Locomotive, it's the right one. Yeah. Locomotive is a framework built on top of Express that really goes crazy with the MVC and REST pattern. I frankly like it, and I love writing in it. So for example, you start off with a routes.js file, and you declare your routes here. So you go this.resources public, system, offers, banner, gifts. This is for like a chat app we're writing. Photo, chatter, queue, all that fun stuff. And then let's take a look at how, for example, Note works. So what Locomotive will do is it will go, all right, you have a resource called Note. I'm going to go into the controllers folder, API v1, and then I'm going to find Note's controller, Note, and then the controller appended to it. And then in here, instead of doing app.get, app.res, you have something called notes.create, notes.show, and then you have notes.index and notes.something else, update. And all that's really doing is create is post. So when you go /note and you post it there, that's going to call the create method. When you go /notes/id, it's going to have a parameter by default called id, and that's what you're going to use. You know, really REST-based. You can have something like, where would I have something? User, I guess. User.index. You can have something there. Let me see, a good example. I guess message, yeah. So message controller.index, so when someone hits /messages and passes some parameters in, it will get the message object. When someone posts to message, it will create it. Okay, regardless. And you can do update, which is a put. You can do delete something, which is a delete. But anyways, you can look in the documentation, and I find Locomotive to be really helpful. It does a lot of the app.gets. Instead of writing app.get over and over again for lots of APIs, Locomotive is great for it. It really encapsulates all that logic and really forces you to think in a REST way. Because as developers, sometimes we'll get lazy and we'll just go app.get, get this by that, right? It's not really REST. It's just a method that you're calling on the server, which is fine for small apps. When you're writing, you know, something that needs a public API and stuff, a REST is the best way to go. It's accepted by everyone. The user, the developer who's using your API won't have to relearn a new API. He just knows if I make a post to users, I'm going to create a user. If I'm going to get user/ID, I'm going to get everything about that user. So that's Locomotive. And I think we're just out of time, so I'm done here too. Yep, thank you. That was all. Any questions? No? Yes? Yes, like the app.get and app.use, how I use the configuration there. Like basically, Locomotive has a config folder called environments, and it has something called all. So depending on if it's a development environment or a production environment, the following code will run. So I have lots of like caching stuff here. And then the same thing, you know, just like how we did for Express, app.use, we have this.use. And this is just a reference to app. And you can call all the stuff you want here. And then we initialize some real-time code at the bottom. So just like it's using the exact same Express concept, it's just placed in different files because Locomotive has its own way of doing things. But it's the exact same concept. You're not learning anything new other than the fact that your files are organized for you because you have to follow this strict guideline. It's pretty strict because if you can't deviate from it, but it's not the dumb kind of strict that where some frameworks force you to do, where it's like no one in the world uses this style. Locomotive follows a strict pattern that everyone uses. It's a REST-based pattern. So it's pretty straightforward. Yep. I think it does. Well, there's two ways of running Locomotive. Locomotive has its own tool like Express where you can create all the project structure and everything for you. The other way of running Locomotive is through a boot.js file, which you just internally call Locomotive because you can't actually do Locomotive. You can't actually go node Locomotive file because Locomotive doesn't create a file. The Locomotive tool automatically bootstraps it for you. So you just have to use the script. It's in the documentation. If you don't want to use the Locomotive tool, you can just use Node that way. Yep. Yeah, there's pretty much, I wouldn't say everyone uses it. A lot of people use it. There's also a bunch of other good frameworks out there. Like Locomotive is built on top of Express, so you're not using Express directly. There's a lot of other good frameworks out there. I can't remember the name. PayPal, I'm not sure if PayPal's framework is based on Express. They have something called Kraken, I think. But Express is pretty good if you want to build APIs and stuff, right? If you're trying to do something like command line tools, other stuff like that, then obviously you won't use Express. If you're building some sort of like straight up WebSocket backend, then maybe you'll use Express, maybe not, right? You can always use Socket.io with Express, but you don't have to. You can just get Socket.io to listen on its own. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Yes. 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 Yeah. So yeah, and then Express 4 I think is integrating some generator pattern too. But yeah, Koa is totally it's a rewrite of Express almost, but in the generator pattern way. We're using lots of promises and generators and all that stuff there. Yeah. Cool. All right.